Hello all, and so continuing our Deleuze unit, we are now going to go through the 20th century masterpiece in the D&G series, the second installment to be in particular, with 1,000 plateaus. Of course, this is a very rich, very dense philosophical tome of the 20th century, and we could, as we demonstrated perhaps in these earlier videos, see, Deleuze as he builds his cosmology and his metaphysics out of, chaos and complexity theory and things like that. We could see the resurrection of old philosophical ideas and even mythical aspects to it, but reinvented in this postmodern context. And so I think that's an interesting side note to put here as we look through 1,000 plateaus. And of course the main concept and the theme, if you will, I don't want to say that there's a certain argumentation, as we'll get into, because of the way this text and how it's embodied with postmodern, thinking towards, not having a sort of overarching, grand meta-narrative that everything has to conform and, lay siege to, but to actually, play out in a sort of multiplicitous way, or as we see here, to start with the rhizome. And so the rhizome as a concept, the rhizome is an assemblage of multiplicities with no real linear beginning or end, or a sort of entry point. And of course there's going to be a lot of metaphors with that sort of characteristic, that sort of description of the rhizome, this sort of cross-pollination, this lateral stance, if you will. And you can think of perhaps with Deleuze and how he uses mathematics and the logic of sense with the aleatory point and singularities and his set theory, if you will. And so you can see that perhaps in rhizomatic thought and how these multiplicitous assemblages are formed. But the plateau, as in the name, is an intensity, and it doesn't develop to a climax. And so of course that's structured within this text, where each chapter is a sort of different plateau, and they sort of cross-pollinate into each other. They make a sort of rhizome, but they don't actually have a arborescent, unified, hierarchical theme. It's just a sort of contained package of these signifiers and concepts. And so there's also something to be said about the rhizome in nature, and of course in the plant world, where the arborescent, as they take contingency with, has a strong axis and sort of spinal axis that represents the overcoding and domination, as it overcodes in the regime, the social, if you will, to go back to the social formations and anti-Oedipus. But the rhizome doesn't subject other regimes to it, or has this sort of archetype of a Freudian analysis, if you will, that the mother and the father and the everything must conform to something like a dialectic, if you will. That's not the case with the rhizome. It's laterally grown with no privileged set point. And so you can perhaps see the deconstruction here of the Western, the Faustian tradition of the visual of climbing atop the mountain for the greater unfolding of human history, of the Hegelian dialectic, sitting atop the shoulders of history and trying to find the ultimate truth, and mapping it out from the peripheral of the grand mountain ascension. And so the rhizome, in its qualities, has this aspect of actually pulling apart and deconstructing these structures under the surface. And so they dominate from below as a sort of metaphor, I think, that really fits into French thinking and the French tradition in general, where from underneath you have these social ruptures, this social chaos that undoes these tyrannical or authoritarian ideas or assemblies, as we'll get into, or social aspect to it. And so the rhizome connects at multiple points and adds further dimensions or multiplicities as you enhance into it, in this increasing of dimensions. And so the multiplicity makes for assemblages, and these assemblages, which is another key concept here in the book, are really the means and the connective nature of culture, and how these different cultures collide into each other, as we've referenced with Christianity. They make two distinctions for what assemblages are classified as. And so the first is being the machinic one, and the second being sign regimes. And so the machinic is more into this sort of technological states of affairs, and the second is one of linguistics and language. And so you could think of the nomad as an assemblage of man and horse, and of course you have different social aspects and roles and how they play into assemblages such as marriage. And so the assemblage is basically a principle of connectivity as a form of desire or eroticism, how things connect onto their metaphysical description of the plane of organization. And so Deleuze here, of course, he has that philosophy really of seeing where desire can really go, tracing these lines of flight, as we'll get into, and letting play out this erotic nature of finding connectivity in really unique and different ways. And so the two real principles early on here to understand really is the plane of consistency versus the plane of organization. And the organizational plane is really the multiplicitous realm, contains a lot of the rhizomatic structures that ultimately are required to fill out the dimensions. And so these can be increased onto the plane of organization. The plane of organization is transcendent in the organization of law and the state, whereas the plane of consistency is one of immanence, which is interesting to look at what he has to say about immanence here. The plane of consistency and its organization are connected with no beginning or end. It's kind of like that aleatory point, and it's defragmented at any point given, such as really I think you could say about how memes, they kind of disassemble and reassemble and are sort of these fragmented rhizomes and how they reemerge. And you could also say, of course, in literature and postmodern, with Kafka having unfinished novels, or those novels that sort of have gone away with the linear inference, the linear nature of language and literature in modernity. And so there are two completely different multiplicities that can join together as is their famous example of the orchid and the bee. The orchid, in this example, creates an image of the bee in resemblance, and the bee and the wasps, or the wasp, if you will, the desire to mate ultimately lands, and there's sort of a trickery of the orchid fooling the bee and carrying on the pollen. And so, of course, the bee leaves to ultimately fertilize into a female orchid mate. And so you could see this this assemblage here, where two things that are ultimately becoming each other in this rhizomatic connection. So you have these two aparallel multiplicities forming an assemblage that is parallel to evolution, or, as we'll get into with the deterritorialization and reterritorialization as a concept. The orchid manages to deterritorialize the wasp by making a part of its reproductive process. The bee reterritorializes the orchid by pollen extraction and mating with that image. And so the becoming wasp of the orchid and the wasp becoming of the orchid. And so you could say, perhaps as well, with humans and diseases and these sort of viruses that go across the animal kingdom and fertilize into suddenly being able to reproduce within the human world. And so it's a sort of rhizomatic connectivity between nature and us with the animal world. And so there's a rhizomatic nature, really, as you can see, not just to how diseases connect to us, but how really as a description of post-modern thinkers of the time period, where unlike other thinkers in past civilizations, and then certainly in the German tradition, where there's this sort of linear kind of rich genealogy of working out problems that your predecessors faced before you and trying to work them out into your own time. Whereas the French, they sort of connect and weave in this sort of contemporary rhizomatic way that they write each other's prefaces, they borrow each other's ideas, they collaborate in these works such as Societies of Control with Foucault and Deleuze. Of course, D&G is a collaboration, a sort of multiplicity itself. Also lends to the rhizomatic structure, with how it's able to have this remarkable endurance, whereas the arborescent lends itself to these big event catastrophes, or the tree gets cut down. The rhizome, when it's cut, can grow off and make a new unified point. And so this, of course, is seen with the animal kingdom in pack formation and the rhizomatic nature of these non-hierarchical animal structures, such as the bug swarm, as a sort of signifying rupture in principle, sort of a line of flight, as we've described, and its tracings through deterritorialization. And so deterritorialization is the reification of a multiplicity put with a new set of functions in a new context. So the human hand, of course, once was a paw, and the function as a paw was to grab onto branches and the resources on them. And so eventually, of course, the paw becomes the hand, which is the tool, such as the mouth example for going from eating. And there's something to be said about the logic of sense here, where the eating of words with Lewis Carroll, and that sort of play on meaning between consumption of animals and also having the capacity for logos. And so the tracing of lines of flight are ways in which creativity avoids the capture of overcoded sign regimes and the domination systems at hand, or the establishment, if you will. And so as they go to a discussion on cartography and decalcomania is a tracing or transferring by engraving onto surfaces, whereas cartography is rhizomatic. It's the mapping, because a map, of course, doesn't have a single allotory point. There's no entry or exit. It is always subject to revision as an environment changes, or a body without organs gives onto new possibilities that need to be mapped onto. And so cartography is never has a finished product, and there's never any sort of presupposed categories or peripheries to go along with it. And so this is to, of course, bring in the psychoanalytic discussions of Freud as this sort of grand authority. He's the arborescent model, if you will, of the psychoanalytic tradition. And so he lends off to these models and the mom and father structure. But of course, for D&G, the tracing should be put on the map. The map has to be flexible enough to encompass all the tracings and letting schizoanalysis play out, as Anti-Oedipus would discuss. And so to go back to Freud, trying to redirect and code into a granular center of perspective and a sort of functional role. But the human subject is one of organization, at least in how it appears on the plane. And so you get a subjective enunciation, whereas on the plane of consistency you have these multiplicities in a sort of asubjective manner. The subject isn't actually there. There's a collective assemblage of enunciations, such as Kafka as the mouthpiece for the overcoded German system. But moving along here, D&G want to discuss the several wolves, or 1914, Freud and the Wolfman. And so, continuing on, Deleuze and Guattari are going to take aim at the single ego structure to put forth their own theory of the psyche, this sort of singular point as a relationship to the superego. And so D&G wants to put that the psyche is a multiplicity of these differing egos, such as the schizo model, the model of a multiplicitude of fragmented images. And so this fragmented multiple self in the schizo model is a result, really, I think, and ultimately whether or not you morally agree with such an analysis. We can't forget that this is a very real description of what hypermodernity really is all about, with trying to piece together a sort of unified ego, or at least seeing this sort of vacancy of one now, or living it out, because you just have these fragmented images, these multi-egoic celebrities and selves put forth onto the light speed technological gridding, and this disassembles the self. You have these clone avatars, and as such, this sort of psychological confusion is, many people actually are starting to, prefer objects of hypermodernity, I would say, and perhaps that's a launching point off of Deleuze's philosophy that I think needs to be looked at in future videos. But without going off, too far and trying to defend, the importance of Deleuze's philosophy and how it actually describes the world after World War II, to continue with Freud's analysis of the Wolfman dream. The wolves are sitting in trees, and Freud applies the tracing of these molar unities of the story of the wolves as these molar aggregates into humanly roles such as the father and the mother. And so this is a reductionary to the schizoanalysis of multiplicities, and the breaking down to molar aggregates into a singular one. And so Freud's ego becomes, the hero or the grandmother or the father that is trying to control the mass of human psyche that is ultimately multiplicitous and can't really, just be pinned down with these, over-coded roles that, lack ambiguity or are always trying to escape from. And so the second dream is, a woman out in the crowd in the desert. And these are both examples of dreams of multiplicities upon bodies without organs. And so bodies without organs, of course, is a very famous concept in this text here, and instrumental to understanding Deleuze's philosophy in this book, or just in general. And so the body without organs as a concept is any ground or field of intensities or potentials upon which multiplicities are then played out as organs themselves. And so the multiplicities appear as organs and link into assemblages for the plane of organization that aggregate and organizes in a larger way, creating, bigger structures, if you will. And so the body without organs, the multiplicities presuppose bodies without organs, and the bodies without organs are linked to the plane of consistency. And so the plane of consistency is the sum total of bodies without organs, of energies, that multiplicities, that organizes itself. So what he's really trying to get at is, of course, there's this self-organization. And so the wolf dream, the tree is the body without organs, where the wolf, or the rhizomatic pack sits upon. Whereas in the desert, the crowd is a multiplicity or rhizome that appears on the desert as the body without organs. The body without organs in both cases are the ground that connects the rhizomatic and builds the higher structures, or even disassembles them. Lends to the possibilities, if you will. And so, just as extensivities are the aspects of the physical world, this is as Deleuze would have pointed out in his earlier works, the extensive is one of measurements of quantitatively evaluating properties, such as the body of water, having a sort of divider, if you will, a landmark that splits it into two forms. But of course, there's these hidden intensities, such as within difference and repetition, where you have those hidden properties that are obstructed from extensive measurements, and so the intensities cannot be divided without ultimately changing what the system is at hand, sort of creation of a new assemblage, if you will, a new becoming that blows away the systematic thought created before it. And so you have the intensivity of the difference of water temperature in that example. And so intensivities are linked to the plane of consistency here, and extensivities are ones of organization or on the macromolecular level, and on the consistent level you have the micromolecular level. And so there's perhaps a really interesting distinction that D&G wants to point out with the mass, the crowd, has a sort of hierarchical organization by a leader or a sort of person put into a chain of command, whereas in the pack, you have a sort of own unity despite belonging to this greater assemblage within the pack. And so I think this lends into really one of the great discussions of our century, and where one stands with his own individual evaluation, and who they actually are, and where they stand with their tribe and the defense of that tribe and that way of life. And you could see perhaps again, it's this sort of multiplicity of these competing tribes as we see in this global village landscape now. The global village is a sort of body without organs unto itself that is playing out these tensions or these new assemblages that we'll have. And so packs and tribes cannot dissolve the subject back into the ego. Tribes and packs are collectives where the ego cannot be on the plane of consistency. So the subject dissolves into a collective assemblage. The subject is only on the plane of organization, plainly put. And so D&G can be seen for the collective observations really of mass culture after World War II, with this psychoanalytical analysis here of really the schizo and one of the multi-ego, the multiplicity of these different desires even within the human form as we know it right now. And so just to continue, the plane of organization has the macro multiplicities or the arborescent models in this case. And of course, D&G are trying to privilege or look away from the plane of organization. I think it's fair to say that they are more interested in the plane of consistency. And so the plane of consistency is the rhizomatic micro multiplicities that has application to our culture forms today, politics, of course. It lends to how revolutions and social revolts and social angst, but of course, as famously put, the rhizome famously is a great metaphor as it comes into being in Deleuze's thought, alongside with the rise of the internet through the military-industrial complex. And so it's interesting to see one of the most defining technological differences that you could perhaps say makes the hand turn from the hand of tool to the one onto the keys, onto the one of just making surface effects come into being, into the hypermodern objectivity, perhaps as a way of looking at this, just as the case with the rhizome or social revolutions that are from the bottom up, through the codifying roles, if you will. There's no central point. It's very rhizomatic. There's no entry point. You can't just cut the serpent's head off, or cut the arborescent leader's head off and just expect the pack to die off. Of course, it's It's very much different in this rhizomatic way of looking at things, and shows the endurance really of the rhizome as a concept across the animal kingdom, and of course in deterritorialization and how human life is lived. But moving on to one of the richest and densest parts of really Deleuze and Guattari's career, I would say, is of course the geology of morals, or who does the earth think it is. And this is ultimately a chapter that really gives a huge cosmological picture of how strata appear on the plane of organization, and how they interact and assemble and self-organize. And so the three types of strata is the physiochemical strata, the organic, and the anthropomorphic strata. And so each of these have a double articulation, a double claw pincher, as we'll get into, of content and expression through not just form and substance. And so the analysis of the plane of organization, the rhizome is an analogy to the plane of consistency, but of course this is only useful insofar that the plane of organization and consistency are far more complex and contain far more than just the rhizome condensing it down. And so you have multiplicities that connect laterally, and is similar to how the plane of consistency is the realm between or the exterior of all the multiplicities in the ebb and flow of these different intensities. And so that's a rough upshot of both the planes here as these metaphysical principles. And so the plane of consistency is one of unformed matter, but is of course not completely disorganized, because this is of course the continuum of flows. And so the body without organs is a sort of it appears at least that it's just anarchic and just flowing just endlessly, and there's nothing to it. But there's of course these different degrees of intensities and relations, though. And this of course steps into the abstract machine, which organizes and actualizes matter brought forth to the body without organs, and how they are relative to each of the strata. And so the realm where all of the organizing ideas come from, or the abstract machines, is you can make the comparison here to the virtual ideas in Deleuze's earlier thought. Each stratum is organized by different abstract machines, and the abstract machines function as a sort of composition of unity to the universal of the particular strata coming from the plane of consistency. Ultimately, this is just mapping onto that process. And so the abstract machine requires the body without organs to come to be, and the processes of the machinic assemblages are the directives, really the imperatives of the plan from the abstract machine onto the body without organs that lends to possibilities in the flows to being captured and organized. And so the plane of consistency is where the realm of abstract machines interrelate to organized formed substance within the strata, which are organized from the plane of consistency, which are things as they appear in the plane of consistency, is this de-stratification of all these elements which are broken down, which is of course very similar to how you would look at how postmodern art, there's this raw sort of flows of the bareness that ultimately though lend to these strata and reappear next to each other as this sort of analogy of the black holes that rub against genetic messaging, or electrons crashing into language, as they discussed. And so the plane of consistency, as I mentioned before, it appears to be anarchic, but this is ultimately also where the abstract machines confer order and organization to the strata. And so the machinic assemblages effectuate giving these directives and ordinates between the strata, and so this determines how the relationships of strata, one strata can become a substratum, and the machinic assemblage effectuate the will and act as the sort of glue through its active imperatives to these strata. Kind of holds everything together. And so such as the example really of the cultural nomadic war machine, or the state apparatus, or of course these different relationships on the scientific basis of protons to cells. The machinic assemblages, of course, cannot act alone and require those abstract machines from consistency that ultimately gives the formula, or the rubric, if you will, of how the potentials of flows in order to actually materially realize it. And so, in the example of the geological stratum, or stratum, which is contained within the physiochemical realm, the stratum, they say that each strata, of course, differs in content and expression. And so the content, in this case, is how the process of acts as formation, where molecular particulars are selected from flows, which are statistical aggregates, making up the material as these statistical aggregates, whereas form are the particulars chosen at the level of content. And so at the level of expression, you have the stability and molar aggregate level of forming a stability. The realm of expression is the stable or rock geological form. But the double articulation of the two pinchers with the claw of content and expression on this geological level could be seen here. And so moving to the abstract machines on the physiochemical level, this is one of energy that functions as the unity for the strata on that level. And the morphogenesis, or the anthropomorphic level, is put into the molecular process. So the double articulation is protein fibers formed out of molecules, and is expressed by forming together. Things are always seemingly folded together to create larger systems, larger complexities. And so the second pincher of content and process. And so then they discuss, rather interestingly, the animal really as the abstract machine. This is the theory that all animals are manifestations of a single abstract machine or animal that generates by elongating and stretching and folding of the different vertebrae, which can be folded into a cephalopod, and then you fold the feet and the head, creating a squid cephalopod. So the animal for D&G, as I said, is these abstract machines, that give this sort of unity of composition to organization in the animal kingdom. And then moving on to the alloplastic level, or the non-biological materials. These are the hand tool expression, or the face and expression in double articulation. And so there's the pragmatic use of hands and tools, and then the second articulation of the semiotic realm of sign regimes and language. And so at the anthropomorphic level, the abstract machine is the machine, the semiotic machine at the linguistic level is the concrete machinic levels of tools, or the machinic assemblages themselves. And then so deterritorialization then for D&G is most found on this level in the human life compared to these other forms here. Deterritorialization, starting from the anatomy with the paw to the hand, of course the lips and the teeth, which are made for the breast and food consumption, changes of course to linguistic semiotics, and so even on the exteriors, such as going from the bare bottom forest level to the steppe, and then of course the deterritorialization of that brings on to the domestication of fire. And so these sort of inventions, these lines of flight within human life that ultimately fuels the creation of new tools, of new means. And so the human world is the most deterritorialized. And the environment is a sort of scripture or background as body without organs, which is in the example of the desert or the trees with the wolfman. And so our ideas about the environment or myth creation actually relies within the abstract machines. And so the machinic assemblage, such as writing tools and how we trace things with the connection of pen, paper, and hand, this is a sort of oversimplification of the plane of consistency or the plane of composition, or as they'll call it, immanence, organizes the forms in their immanence, and the plane of organization. So you could see perhaps the Platonic forms really coming through here again, in a totally unique and ultimately different way by putting these ideas in the actual immanence of it themselves through the difference of intensive individuation fields, which of course gives way to material forms or the world of extensivities. And so D&G, despite obviously working with a material framework within the sciences of the later half of the 20th century, is ultimately putting a path of metaphysics into the the principles of the plane of consistency that make up the extensive actualities themselves. And so the idea of self-organization, the abstract machines give the ideas that diagram this mapping of what the consistencies are that ultimately organize the strata and onto each level give way to its own composition. It's a reinvention in a postmodern materialist framework, I think, to say of the chain of being that doesn't have a perhaps the human being at the top of it and its use of reason, but all of these strata and compositions actually interweave into each other, and so there's no one privileged perspective here. And so D&G, of course, are moving away from organization or a sort of divine hand in this self-organization through complexity and chaos theory. And so there can be, for D&G at least, no greater consciousness evolution or no greater historical narrative truths or an ends, a telos of human flourishing. The body without organs doesn't operate like that. It isn't directive, but just exudes these possibilities from the abstract machines. In fact, there's a sort of tension, really, you could say, of trying to get away from the forms as much as possible, because there's this sort of I think again, Deleuze has this sort of vitalism within him in his time period. I think it's one of the things he really retains from Nietzsche, perhaps more than people give credit for. and how here you could see that it's trying to break out of these abstract machines, these modes of content, really. This and of course this applies to more to anti-Oedipus with social formations, the coding process of the state as a capture of these flows that codes onto, such as the case, of course, with taxation and commerce. But I think I've really covered certainly the plane of consistency here in the first half of the text, and I look forward to giving more introductions to these ideas as they flesh out in these plateaus in the coming chapters, and ultimately do my own hermeneutics as well, or flesh them out even further than I have here. I kind of rambled quite a bit. I'm sorry about that, but again, sorry for the delay. I meant to have this video out last week, and I hope you guys enjoy it. And make sure to like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you for the next one. Thanks.